There is no such thing as a country that is immune to authoritarianism. As long as a country is made up of people, there will always be the risk that the wrong individuals could rise to power, and that rights could begin to erode. The United States is no exception to this rule. When we think about totalitarianism, dictatorships, or dystopian societies in general, we often picture works like 1984, Brave New World, Animal Farm, or The Hunger Games, stories typically set either in the distant future or outside of the United States. While there are books that explore the idea of an American dictatorship, they tend to be less widely known. The Handmaid's Tale is one of them. In recent years, due to political developments and the success of its television adaptation, The Handmaid's Tale has grown in popularity. It was originally written by Canadian author Margaret Atwood in the 1980s, during a period when the religious right in the United States was resurging in response to the progressive movements of the 1960s and 70s. Set in what was then the near future, the story imagines an America where the US government collapses amid a fertility crisis and a civil war. In its place rises a theocratic dictatorship known as the Republic of Gilead. In Gilead, women, gay people, racial minorities, non-Christians, and even Christians from different denominations are stripped of their rights. At the same time, fertile women are forced by the state to bear children. The story is told from the perspective of Offred, an oppressed concubine whose family and former life is taken from her almost overnight. Aside from a modest film adaptation in 1990, the story mostly remained a literary staple until Hulu released a modern TV adaptation in 2017, bringing it into the mainstream. But this video isn't meant to be a review of the book or a retelling of the plot. Instead, it aims to explain how Gilead came to exist. Now, as with most dystopian stories, The Handmaid's Tale wasn't originally intended to be an alternate history. Like 1984 though, it technically counts as one simply due to the dates being in the past. That said, nailing down dates for The Handmaid's Tale has been a nightmare, as the author was intentionally vague about when the story is set. Hell, most people in Gilead aren't even allowed to access calendars. Luckily, when the show came along, this newspaper Easter egg came in clutch and gave me a proper reference point around which I could manually reconstruct a timeline. Even then, I still found it quite difficult. At one point, I had to rely on the descriptions of the weather and the main character's pregnancy, all paired with mental maths, to work out when everything was even going on. The show also contains a few timeline inconsistencies, many of which I had to just flat out ignore. Thankfully, the internet has also been very helpful in my efforts, especially in these artificial Wikipedia pages I found on Reddit. These will act as a backbone for this video as well. I should also warn that, while covering this timeline, I may be dropping a few spoilers from the book, show, and even the sequel story that comes after The Handmaid's Tale. As an additional warning before I begin, I've personally watched this show all the way through twice, and it was an experience. There were lots of moments which were very triggering and sometimes just disturbing. I had to take breaks a few times because of how angering some of the episodes were. The same happened when I was reading both of the books. Besides the long series of injustices, what also made this series so disturbing is how recent the point of divergence is. The majority of you watching who are currently of the age of approximately 17 to 18 and who live in the US would have most likely existed in the THT universe and would have been directly affected by the changes I'm about to describe. I'll try not to go into too much detail, but just to be on the safe side, I'll say that viewer discretion is advised. And if you do end up reading the book or watching the show, I'd probably say the same thing. It is not for the faint-hearted. With that out of the way, here is my full timeline of the Handmaid's Tale universe. Before we get anywhere close to the POD, we have to go over some historical context. For that, we have to go back to the 1960s and 70s, during the time when the counterculture and second-wave feminist movements were in full swing. This time saw an immense amount of social change. With the rise of the contraceptive pill in 1960 and the sexual revolution that followed, people no longer felt pressured to get married and have children. Books like The Feminine Mystique critiqued the lack of choice and limited roles available to women in post-war society. Women now had more freedom to choose to work on their careers rather than pursue a family. While this did wonders in bringing America closer to gender equality, some argue that it also ended the post-war baby boom that had been going on, kickstarting a very gradual decline in birth rates across the developed world. Women weren't the only group making gains at this time. African Americans had the Civil Rights Act and the beginning of desegregation in the South. The Stonewall riots in 1969 also sparked a more visible and organized gay liberation movement across the country, giving rise to the modern LGBT movement. In the 70s, the introduction of no-fault divorce and the 1973 Supreme Court ruling on abortion only accelerated these changes. Importantly, while many of these changes expanded personal freedom and equality, they were not experienced the same way by everyone. As divorce rates climbed, many conservative groups began calling out what they feared to be a breaking down of the family. Retrospectively dubbed Generation X, those born during the 60s and 70s also felt increasingly alienated by this loud counterculture. The 1980s saw a sudden swing back to the right in politics, a swing which was partly the reason why Reagan ended up in the White House. In spite of this, the 80s was still seen as a time of hedonism, overconsumption, debauchery, and cultural passion, all within the backdrop of the AIDS epidemic and Cold War anxiety. Many further right of the spectrum saw this and concluded that society had lost its morals and innocence. New evangelical Christian groups formed, calling for a return of traditional family values and even religion in government. As time went on, these groups would only grow, drawing in both old conservative politicians and disillusioned young adults. Anti-feminist reprisals also became more common too, voicing direct opposition to policies like abortion. As the Cold War wrapped up and the 90s dawned, the US emerged as the uncontested global superpower. Capitalism and consumerism climbed in the midst of a culture war, leading to a society that to many felt increasingly directionless. In truth, though it was an era of relative peace, the 90s was also an era of great internal anger and cynicism. Birth rates continued to travel downwards, while pollution went up with factories and landfills. Globalization meant the world was more connected, but it also meant that many Americans lost their primary and secondary sector jobs. And although rioting and crime peaked at this time, it still contributed to a perception of growing civil disorder. The fragile feeling of peace in America was also shattered in 2001, when the Twin Towers collapsed on 9/11 and the War on Terror broke out. Y2K hopes of a bright and limitless new millennium quickly disappeared. Social media began to take off in the mid-2000s, and more people felt emboldened to share information and spread their opinions online. The rise of dating apps and the early Me Too movement later on led to greater accountability, but also more gender-based tension. The official point of divergence for The Handmaid's Tale is not explicitly stated, but I've decided to place it in early February of 2008. Around this time, concerning reports begin to come out of birth rates dropping to uncomfortable levels, particularly in North America and East Asia. The exact reasons for this are not quite clear though, not even to the reader. One theory blames high levels of plastic pollution and ecological damage, both in the air and the sea, combined with the prevalence of toxic processed farm goods laced with chemicals. Meanwhile, in the book, the antagonists blame it on the popularity of abortion and birth control. In the epilogue of the book, it is also strongly suggested that there was some kind of sterility-causing virus that broke out of a lab and silently spread throughout the population. There is also mention of a syphilis epidemic, or some kind of STD as well. Because the cause is not clearly defined in both the book or the show, we'll just assume that the issue is multifaceted. In March of 2008, there is also a strange rise in miscarriages across the United States. Scientists and doctors scramble to find answers. Around this time, a handful of prominent American right-wing Christian conservative groups, most of whom had existed for a while by now and were already well established, merged to create a new organization, a far-right conservative think tank known simply as the Sons of Jacob. There is no evidence to suggest that their formation is as a direct result of the birth rate drop, but we can say that there is an element of opportunism. The Sons of Jacob, as a group, are quite strange. At a base level, it is a secretive religious, ultra-conservative organization that advocates for a return to traditional values in the midst of increased social tensions and fertility issues. Beyond that, their beliefs and internal structure are quite vague and broad, and the book and the show often clash when it comes to some details about them. We know for certain that they are staunchly misogynistic and anti-feminist, calling for the banning of abortion and birth control and a return to traditional gender roles. In the books, they're also quite racist. The show seems to completely look over this fact, though, with people of different racial and ethnic backgrounds being seen at every level of society. Since the book's version sounds more realistic for a group of this nature, that's the one we'll go with. The racist ideology is not as apparent early in its existence, though. Lastly, even though they clearly define themselves as a Christian group and aim to make America a pure Christian country, what kind of Christian they are becomes very unclear as more people join. Besides believing that other religions are intolerable, they also hate most other non-Protestant Christian denominations, especially Catholics. Theologically speaking, it's actually pretty hard to call them Christian at all. They put a lot of emphasis on the Old Testament over the New. In fact, besides a few random verses here and there and a cherry-picked version of the Beatitudes from the Gospel of Matthew,
Blessed are the meek, dear.
there's rarely any mention of the New Testament at all by them in the show. Though I personally am not religious, I do know that it is basically impossible to be a Christian without acknowledging the New Testament extensively. Just from memory, in all 6 seasons of the show, I recall the word Jesus being used around 5 or so times, in a show that revolves around a Christian theocracy, mind you. The group instead prefers to just use the word God. The cross symbol is used occasionally, but once again, there is no link made to Christ. All these details are more important later though. For now, if you want to know what the SOJ looks like, just imagine the Westboro Baptist Church on steroids and with much greater lobbying power and influence. Also with some Puritan elements mixed in there as well. The rest of 2008 goes mostly the same until around the late summer. The global financial crisis still occurs, only it's 10 times worse. The Great Recession is therefore also more severe than in our timeline. Unemployment spikes, and livelihoods are destroyed. As hope in the future dwindles, so does the already plummeting birth rate. By January of 2009, the birth rate is suddenly dangerously low. In America, only 1 in 5 pregnancies are successful, with the other 4 resulting in miscarriages. In most of the rest of the world, the rate is around 3 out of 5, while in countries like China, it basically drops to 0. An infertility crisis is officially declared. Obama still wins the 2008 election, but this time in an even greater landslide. Emergency economic measures at the beginning of his term stabilizes the recession somewhat, but not enough for the employment situation to go back to normal. The EU countries struggle greatly and turn to protectionism and isolationism. The US follows suit, as tent settlements continue to grow in the Midwest and California. For the sons of Jacob, this crisis is a godsend. After all, panic creates the best breeding ground for authoritarianism. During this time of panic, and especially once Obama's term begins in 2009, they use social media and the internet as a means to pump out pro-fundamentalist propaganda, particularly on sites like Facebook and Twitter. After some consolidation within the group, their overall message becomes more clear. Society is struggling with economic depression and infertility because God is punishing us for our immorality and degeneracy. America has strayed too far into a messy world of liberalism and in doing so has lost itself. In order to fix all this, we must embrace traditionalism to the highest degree, rebuild the family, clean up the environment, bring back a simpler way of life where everyone knows their place in society, and most of all, encourage all women back into domestic roles. All of this is done under the slogan of restoring stability in the country and responding to the national emergency. They aren't openly extremist at first, and early on in their existence there is factionalism. Some are more religious, while others are more opportunistic. Nevertheless, their message is very comforting to many Americans struggling with economic burdens and infertility. Going into the 2010s, membership grows, even amongst women. Disenfranchised, unemployed young men are also increasingly interested in joining. Many of them go on to join the more radical factions of the group. Later on, a small underground security or paramilitary force is also formed to maintain the safety of its members. When it comes to propaganda, they carefully manage their message depending on who they're talking to. When appealing to the wider general public, they're more soft and respectable, promoting family values, protecting children from harm and immorality, etc., etc. Within the group is where we find more calls for stricter gender roles and religious social control. It's only within the group's inner circles that their ideology becomes explicitly more extremist. Overall, for the first half of the decade or so, they try not to draw too much negative attention to themselves, while also increasing their influence by appealing to the more far-right sections of the US government and military. All the while, the Obama administration finds itself too wrapped up in the economy to concern itself with the rise of radicalism, a poor strategy which will eventually come back to get him. In the 2010 midterms, and especially the 2012 election, social media is used to fuel mass hysteria and spread extremist propaganda and misinformation. Populism goes on the rise big time. More congressional, gubernatorial, and even presidential candidates spew out inflammatory rhetoric against women, gays, and immigrants. Many people still elect them into office, either because they're willing to look past their views or because they think they're joking. Obama wins the 2012 election by a hair, and the right-wing response to this victory is much more severe. Universities become riot grounds, and assassinations become more common. By the beginning of his second term, he presides over a staunchly Republican Congress in both the House and the Senate, finding it harder to enact any major policies. Many states in the US have also elected pretty right-wing governments, even by America's standards. As the fertility crisis worsens, these states start to crack down on certain rights, the main ones being abortion and birth control. In 2011, Alabama becomes the first state to pass a law requiring women to obtain a husband or male next of kin's signature to access abortions and contraceptives, a move that creates upset. This, however, is only the beginning in a long line of very concerning legislation. Even states that we'd consider more liberal, such as Massachusetts and Rhode Island, begin legally requiring doctors and abortion clinics to discourage women from getting an abortion before undergoing the procedure. Male vasectomies also see a near-complete ban. These are all labeled as temporary crisis measures and emergency population policy. Protests occur, but are too disorganized. The rest of the world also experiences infertility issues at varying degrees. In 2011, the Arab Spring backfires and leads to the rise of fascist military states in countries like Egypt and Algeria. The Syrian civil war still breaks out, as does a civil war in Tunisia. Japan, China, and South Korea all declare a state of emergency due to basically having no more babies. The EU countries, meanwhile, grow closer together amidst economic downturn. The European Fertility Research Project is also founded to lead the fight against infertility. Overall, the nations of the EU are far more dependent on each other in this universe, eventually meaning that Brexit never happens. 2013 is a terrible year. In the US, many regions report nearly zero viable births for months on end, and responding to the crisis truly becomes a matter of not just the national survival, but also long-term human survival. Emergency policies sees money poured into fertility programs. The exact cause of infertility is still not exactly known. Many people begin scapegoating women for not wanting to have kids and exposing themselves to sin and disease, therefore making them barren due to God's wrath. Protests and riots, mainly led by religious groups and infertile couples, take place across the country, demanding more action. Many abortion clinics and pharmacies are also bombed and looted. Small-scale shootings take place in media outlets and government buildings too. The opening of the 2013 academic year sees a decline in enrollments in preschools and first grade. Child protective policies are tightened significantly as part of a push to save the children. While the government discusses emergency action, the Sons of Jacob quietly continues to grow. Having established chapters in up to 30 states by this point, they continue to infiltrate the military, intelligence, and law enforcement with members. They also make alliances with fundamentalist churches and nationalist groups. They established their charter in October of 2013, outlining in more detail what they hope to achieve as many begin to expect a conservative wave in the coming 2016 election. Many of their points raise eyebrows amongst some moderate members and outside experts, but don't seem to cause too much upset. Going into 2014, their membership numbers reach roughly 100,000, while their exterior support base exceeds around 6 million Americans, from politicians to military personnel to ordinary people, mostly concentrated around the East Coast and the Midwest. It is at this time that the Feds start to express more concern over their growth. Worrying that their actions could start to pose a threat to national security, they begin carrying out investigations. Suspiciously, in the summer of 2014, the Sons of Jacob suddenly stops negotiating with the government further on policy. Within the group, conversations over who they'll back in the 2016 election are silently ended. The FBI ramps up their investigations, many of which turn out futile as most questioning sessions result in SOJ members spewing out apocalyptic rhetoric instead of cooperating. SOJ rallies start to turn into mass prayer sessions. Something is not right. We now arrive at a very important day, September 11th, 2014. 13 years after 9/11, the US experiences the worst terrorist attack in its history. In Washington, D.C., an army of masked gunmen suddenly break into the Capitol building and open fire, killing most of the congressmen present that day. Not long after, a bomb is detonated at the White House, setting half of it ablaze. Finally, a shooting also breaks out at the Supreme Court. The government is effectively decapitated in a single afternoon. President Obama is shot in one of the shootings and pronounced dead at Georgetown Hospital 2 days later. Vice President Joe Biden manages to flee the Capitol to an unknown location. With the country suddenly descending into a state of panic and large chunks of the presidential line of succession eliminated, the Pentagon sees no other choice but to declare martial law, deploying the National Guard to several cities to quell potential unrest. The attack shocks the country at a scale greater than 9/11. In this confusion, the Constitution is swiftly suspended and the 2014 midterms are delayed indefinitely. A new provisional government, made up mostly of civil servants and military officials, is put in place on September 13th, with the intention of temporarily stabilizing the country and restoring order. People of all faiths across the country attend mass prayer vigils. Schools, universities, and businesses close down the following day, and flags are hoisted at half-mast. The world is in shock. After a few days, the blame for the attacks is officially placed on Islamic terrorists and foreign actors. However, in reality, the attack was most likely orchestrated by the Sons of Jacob. Many of the civil servants in the provisional government are also SOJ sympathizers and even members. After the attacks, many were fine with the provisional government and hoped that a new official president would be elected eventually. What most people didn't understand was just how screwed they were. From this point on, a lot happens in so little time, so just bear with me. In the immediate aftermath of the attacks, there is a resurgence in Islamophobic sentiment. Police presence is heightened in the city of Dearborn, Michigan, where a large number of the population are Muslims. Many Muslim Americans are also unlawfully deported under suspicion of association with ISIS. Sadly, most don't question this inhumane treatment, and protests are mostly ignored. Anti-Muslim hate crimes also spike. On September 15th, after a convention in Annapolis, the provisional government begins passing the authority and reason laws. A stream of executive orders are passed by the acting president William Knightley, supposedly designed to restabilize the country and prevent further economic downturn. In reality, the laws are put in place to keep the Constitution suspended and martial law in place indefinitely, as well as suspend all remaining elections across the country. Some other effects are even more questionable. The new laws also give law enforcement special power to hunt down ISIS affiliates, partly by suspending the Bill of Rights. All religious meetings or gatherings across the country also become supervised by government authorities. Most controversially, the provisional government also centralizes and limits the use of the internet in the US. Anyone engaging in perceived conspiracy or treason would be banned immediately. Any of the few online posts made that criticize this new authoritarianism are swiftly taken down without a trace. Many other websites and articles are also randomly deleted. Several social media sites and platforms are raided and moderated. In an effort to limit dangerous content, many YouTube videos, anti-government articles, and websites are taken down or blocked without explanation. Throughout October and November, many states also adopt internet decency codes that limit or outright ban adult content from being viewed online. Most shops and businesses that promote pornography are also shut down. This is all done in the name of protecting the children and preventing instability. Over time, online algorithms start to favor patriotic content, religious messaging, and family values, while suppressing anything to do with women's rights, LGBT issues, and protesting. A round of news laws are also passed in October which does the same thing but to non-mainstream news sites, in an effort to curb misinformation. Radio stations across the country start to only play music simply due to how expensive and risky running headlines becomes. As winter rolls around, many cities begin to experience rolling blackouts, sometimes going hours without electricity or internet access. In December, as part of a new birth drive, Roe v. Wade is overturned, with only some protest. Many are too distracted by panic and economic trouble to care about losing their rights. In fact, many see these policies as necessary to protect the country in the midst of an emergency. Most are also given a false sense of security, thinking all these measures are temporary. Going into 2015, things don't get better. For some reason, many discrimination protection laws are repealed. Researchers report a rise in school bullying and hate crimes amidst a line of don't say gay laws. School educators also become encouraged to report apparent immoral behavior to the authorities. Homophobic and racist hate crimes also go on the rise around the country. Later on, some states even start to revoke the marriage licenses of many same-sex married couples. In mid-January, a report comes out stating that terrorist cells, aided by Mexican drug cartels, have been using planes and illegal border crossings to jump in and out of the US. In response, the PG enacts a partial suspension on traveling. 7 days after this announcement, anti-government hackers leak secret White House documents detailing plans to soon enact a total ban on all travel in and out of the country for any reason. This triggers the White Flight scandal, a national panic where swathes of people begin seeking to leave the country and never come back. Airports become unbearably crowded. This is the point where most celebrities and CEOs begin to leave the country in droves. Google and YouTube moved their headquarters to Vancouver in Canada in early February. Many other large companies follow suit. 2 weeks after the scandal, the government silently changes travel regulations so that only dual citizens or foreigners are allowed to leave the country. Rioting occurs in 20 cities, and the UN finally gets their act together and places sanctions on the provisional government. Canada and Mexico become overwhelmed with immigrants, and quotas are quickly put in place. More foreign companies quietly pull their assets out, and more American millionaires and even billionaires move to Canada throughout February and March. A recession takes place as the values of major American companies take a hit. Many tech facilities, former HQs, and colleges are also left abandoned and derelict across Silicon Valley. National Guard units are ordered to crack down hard on rioters. To make the process of law enforcement less time-consuming, the National Guard is then quietly merged with the police to create a unified law enforcement group known simply as the Guardians. The new uniforms are unlabeled and ominously all black. The transition happens swiftly, though some resistant officers leave. Crackdowns only become harsher. On February 25th, another key law is passed unanimously, known as the Reformed Women's Bill. In its own words, it orders the immediate removal of women from positions of authority and work. It also orders that women's bank accounts be frozen and that all assets owned by women should be passed to the male next of kin. At first, leniency is given to some jobs in which women overwhelmingly dominate, like elementary school teaching. Most others aren't so lucky. Employers are given no choice but to fire their female employees. Guardians in major US cities carry out a forced clear-out of women from places of work. This comes suddenly and without explanation. Immediately, protests and riots break out in the days after this act. The mayors of cities like San Francisco, New York, Houston, Dallas, and Detroit all resist this bill and order that no women be removed from employment. Guardian units are overpowered in those cities by mobs, while in other cities like Boston and Washington, D.C., protesters are crushed brutally, sometimes even with bombs. This only draws more global condemnation and sanctions, further crippling the economy. On March 3rd, the UN declares it's moving its headquarters from New York City to Geneva in Switzerland over increased hostility from an unfriendly government in America. Refugee numbers only continue to increase in Canada and Mexico, while the US government continues to lose control over major cities west of the Mississippi. To explain what's going on behind the scenes, since the arrival of the provisional government, the Sons of Jacob, or people affiliated with them, have gradually increased their presence and influence by inserting members in the civil service sector and other key government departments. Over the months, they managed to get more of their policies passed, while having non-SOJ members removed or denounced in one way or another. By the beginning of 2015, they basically have a dominant hold over the US government. Many of the remaining members who oppose these policies also leave out of disgust for the direction the country is going down, though there is still a large chunk of people the SOJ don't have control over. This all changes on March 21st, when the SOJ carries out a quiet coup in the early hours of the morning, rounding up most of the outlying members and throwing them in prison for no stated reason. Most of them would eventually go on to be deported or executed. 4 days later, on March 25, 2015, around 7 a.m., Congress silently votes to dissolve the government of the United States. In its place, a new state is formed, the Divine Republic of Gilead. On March 25th, radio stations around America started only playing Christian music. On March 26th, only lyricless classical music. On March 27th, only static. By April 1st, radios were banned entirely. By the evening, a new flag is raised and the shocking news is broadcast across the world. By the following day, most of the military is secured. What few remaining women who remain employed are finally rounded up and forcibly removed. Non-compliant employers are executed on the spot. Many women who once held professional jobs, such as teaching, medicine, law, etc., are taken away to massive facilities and kept there for days in a state of fear and confusion and without any explanation. The announcement of Gilead's independence sends the entire world into a state of panic on a scale never seen before. Within the days after the declaration, the US dollar becomes more worthless than toilet paper, and stock markets in major nations crash, triggering a second Great Depression. The economic turmoil causes companies across the world to close down. Within 3 months, global unemployment levels reach an estimated 15%. The vast majority of the world's countries refuse to recognize Gilead as a legitimate state, and place even more sanctions in response to Gilead's refusal to remove the authoritarian policies placed by the previous US government. Within Gilead, fighting breaks out almost instantly. Many more try to flee the country, but are suddenly blocked by ruthless border patrols. As an emergency measure, the government of Gilead closes all of the borders, bans all travel, and temporarily cuts all the power from the country. For the first time, America goes silent. Within a week, all opponents to the regime around Washington, D.C. are eliminated, while most eastern states are secured under the new regime. Although most of New York State is secured quickly, the city of New York rises up, with the mayor and most of the National Guard and NYPD siding with the protesters. The revolt succeeds, and on April 10th, NYC is declared the capital of the new reformed USA. Fighting breaks out in many places elsewhere. Across the country, chunks of the US military that refuse to swear allegiance to Gilead rebels. The West Coast becomes a hotbed for rebellion too. Although Gilead manages to secure the East Coast Navy, most of the Navy on the West Coast refuses to recognize the new government, instead siding with the new US in New York. Emboldened by the discontent from the mainland and the events in New York, the states of Alaska and Hawaii both denounce Gilead and declare themselves part of the US. By April 19th, the separation from Gilead was secure. Many escaped politicians who were formerly part of the provisional government but against the Sons of Jacob managed to make their way to Alaska through Canada. Over the next few months, they combine with military leaders to create a new US government in exile based in Anchorage. As for New York, Gilead lays siege to the city, capturing it on the 24th and committing atrocities in the process. Needless to say, all of this action leads to a second American Civil War. Besides New York and the Pacific states, by the end of May, Vermont, Florida, Texas, and California all declare independence. Organized insurgencies and rebellions break out in Chicago, Detroit, the Dakotas, and some southern states. Former continental US soldiers who refuse to join the new military rise up and occupy massive pockets of the Midwest and the Pacific states, declaring their allegiance to the US. A constitutional convention is held, in which the new country defines itself as a Christian theocratic republic that strongly adheres to Old Testament law. The Constitution also outlines which specific groups are accepted in the eyes of the state. Most religions, as well as most other Christian denominations deemed out of line, are declared heretical. Mormons and Baptists rebel and form militias in Utah and the South respectively. Gilead also constitutionally declares itself God's kingdom on earth, with God himself as the head of state. What this essentially means is that, according to Gilead, if you rebel against the state, you are going against God, which makes you a heretic and therefore deserving of a brutal death. POWs captured by Gilead are slaughtered in the thousands. As fighting swells up in the west, US-led Californian rebels meet Gilead forces in Arizona. Already overwhelmed by fighting elsewhere, Gilead forces are forced to retreat from the city of Phoenix. They also suffer continued failures in the Midwest. To make matters even worse for Gilead, yet another resistance group starts to form. In June, a decentralized resistance organization, simply known as Mayday, is officially created. The cities of Chicago and Detroit soon become hotspots for Mayday cells. Feeling bitter about being kicked back so quickly, Gilead takes on desperate measures to finish their enemies. On July 12th, they launch Operation Sodom and Gomorrah, airstriking a series of nuclear power plants in Missouri, Arizona, Utah, and Southern California. This causes the plants to go into meltdown, triggering one of the worst environmental disasters in human history. The cities of Phoenix, St. Louis, Salt Lake, San Diego, and most of Los Angeles are rendered uninhabitable. The ensuing refugee crisis sends Mexico into a spiral, which leads to martial law in some states and 7 snap elections within the following 9 years. With these disasters, most Midwestern and Mojave rebels are crushed, giving Gilead more breathing room and leaving large portions of the west of Mississippi an irradiated mess. In a state of complete shock, most of the world strengthens their sanctions on Gilead, and the UN releases a resolution refusing to recognize it as a political entity. But all of this is stuff that happens in the war and the rest of the world. The main focus of The Handmaid's Tale, obviously, is what actually goes on inside of Gilead. One of the first things Gilead does when rising to power is cut off internet access, meaning most people living in the eastern states under full Gilead control have no idea what's going on in the West or the rest of the world. For these people, the days after Gilead's founding are incredibly confusing and traumatic. On March 25th, many universities and schools are occupied by guardians. Girls are turned away at the door without explanation. On March 27th, a law is passed ordering pregnant or fertile women to register themselves with the local authorities. Once again, no stated reason is given. An executive order bans all abortion and birth control permanently. In early April, Gilead starts rounding up women from prisons or who are caught trying to escape at the border, taking them to special camps and depots. There, they are medically examined to test for fertility, as is most women in Gilead by this point. Women who test positive are then taken away for redemption. Women who test negative are discarded. In the following weeks, after grabbing hold of legal records, more ordinary women across the country are arrested and taken away. These are women who, according to the law, have sinned against God. Gilead's definition of a sinner is very broad, though. Divorcees, or people who have remarried, are declared adulterers. If they have children, they are declared as unfit parents, and their kids are confiscated by the state. Single parents and gay parents also fall under this category. Countless families are torn apart, and houses are stolen. Women accused of sinning in this way are all rounded up and taken to facilities as well for their new role in Gilead society to be determined. The LGBT community is made illegal as an extremist movement, and gay people are suddenly labeled as gender traitors and a direct threat to fertility. Most of them are executed in mass hangings throughout the remainder of the year, or, in the case of women, sent to redemption. Disabled people are also targeted and killed off by the state. In the midst of unrest in cities like Detroit, Chicago, and New Orleans, Gilead chalks up an excuse to have swarms of black people arrested without trial. Thousands of protesting African Americans are also massacred by guardians, prompting full insurgent uprisings. Arab and Muslim Americans also join in. In response, on May 4th, Gilead launches Operation Moses, a 2-day bombing campaign that completely flattens the city of Detroit. On May 9th, Gilead officially labels black Americans as the Children of Ham. Over the summer, black communities across the country are rounded up and transported to the plains and the Rocky Mountains, where they are segregated away from the rest of the society in rundown settlements called the National Homelands. Latinos, Arabs, Asians, and Native Americans all meet a similar fate. Across rural America, many report hearing the sound of distant freight trains bound for nowhere, quietly disappearing into the night without a trace. As for the nation's Jews, most of them are deported and sent on ships bound for Israel as part of a repatriation scheme. In the middle of the Atlantic, however, many of these ships mysteriously sink. Having inherited a large part of the former US's superpowerhood, there's little the rest of the world can do besides isolate them, as under Noah's doctrine, Gilead declares that any attempt at invasion by the international community will result in nuclear war. NATO is also too debilitated to respond at this time. Universities and scientific centers are purged. Professors and intellectuals are executed or exiled. Male college students are drafted, while females are taken away for redemption. Catholics are persecuted too. Churches are bombed, priests are executed, and nuns are taken away for redemption. You may be wondering what redemption actually is. It's all part of the new government's push to re-roll society. One of Gilead's founding aims was to separate the genders and raise the failing birth rate. This would be much easier if everyone in society was reminded of their place. Very quickly, Gilead bans women from reading and begins a near-complete erasure of words from public life. Street signs and billboards are removed, and a cultural revolution begins so as to de-Americanize the country and bring them back to a state of Puritan innocence. Bookstores and galleries are emptied. Door-to-door clear-outs also begin, with guardians forcibly confiscating modern technology and firearms from ordinary citizens. Massive bonfires are lit, where countless books, phones, computers, CDs, clothes, and paintings are burned. Their manufacturers are either publicly shamed or publicly hung. Mount Rushmore and the Lincoln Memorial are blown up, as is St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York. Pop music is outlawed, with only classical or lyricless hymns being tolerated. Christmas is also banned as a commercialized pagan holiday. Most factories are closed, renewables are adopted en masse, and plastic is banned in an effort to fix the pollution issue. This is probably the only good thing Gilead does. Dress code laws are passed, which basically make it impossible to wear anything normal. Soon, state-issued clothes are given out instead. Women who'd been placed in redemption are sorted. Fertile women are taken away to red centers for reproductive services. After the radioactive destruction during the war, people who serve no purpose to the state are sent out west to clean up the toxic waste and fallout. These western regions are dubbed the colonies. By the end of 2015, America has undergone a horrific transformation, with nearly everybody being socially redefined and color-coded. A very strict hierarchy is set up for both genders. Now I'll take some time to go over all of these new social roles, as they are a very important part of the Handmaid's Tale world. The commanders of the faithful are the elite ruling class in Gilead. They are the patriarchs who make up the government. The government of Gilead functions strangely. It's oligarchical in a way where there's no single ruling commander. Officially, God himself is the commander-in-chief. Every district in Gilead is run by a council of commanders who answers to a set of supreme commanders in Washington, D.C. Despite the name, Gilead is by no means a republic. Commanders are dressed in standard black and white suits and ties. Most commanders were members of the Sons of Jacob before Gilead and came from a wide range of backgrounds in the old US. Dressed in blue and teal dresses, the wives are the highest-ranking women in Gilead. They are married to the commanders and they are mistresses of their households. Despite this, they have very little power. They, like most other women, can't read or write. Most of them are also infertile. Coming from various backgrounds before Gilead too, their lives are basically over. Now, they are mostly confined to their homes, where they knit, paint, embroider, and pray. These people have already been mentioned. The Guardians of the Faithful are the low-ranking law enforcement. They work as drivers, security guards, executioners, and police officers, and work for the commanders. They're all dressed in black, and most of them are young men who were either drafted after Gilead's formation or were recruited by the SOJ. Many were also incorporated from the KKK and other white supremacist groups. The Guardians can also double as military combatants in war zones. The Angels of the Apocalypse are the special soldiers on the front lines of Gilead. Most of them used to be in the US Army, which they now fight against in the western states. They are also in black. Besides the fact that they are the primary executors of the nation's crimes, not much else is known about them. The Eyes of the Lord are essentially the secret police. They are the most feared group of people in Gilead. Also dressed in black and driving around in blacked-out vans, they frequently abduct people from the streets and raid homes. The system works so that basically anyone at any level, even women, can be spying for the Eyes, creating a strong atmosphere of mistrust and paranoia. Many of them were also part of the FBI, CIA, or NSA in the time before. The aunts are a very special class of women in Gilead. They are mostly middle-aged or older women who were highly skilled professionals in the time before, doctors, lawyers, judges, etc. Their primary purpose is managing and policing other women in Gilead and enforcing Gileadian ideology. They are therefore the only women allowed to read and write. Some of them became aunts as opportunists, while others were genuine believers, even sadists. They come dressed in brown robes. Econo people are literally just average everyday citizens. Most ordinary suburban Americans just became econo people. This means that they make up the majority of Gilead's society. Their lives are pretty basic, they have minimal rights, and their clothing options are limited to dull green and grey garments. But, it is argued, they are the luckiest group in the country, as they aren't caught up in the brunt of all the oppression. They keep their heads down, attend church, and try not to get into trouble. Econo boys attend schools with a heavily revised curriculum where a twisted version of Christianity is taught in place of the humanities and evolutionary science. Econo girls, on the other hand, are encouraged to get married as soon as possible and, by God's grace, have children. Named after Martha in the New Testament, the Marthas are the female housemaids and servants who work for the commander's households or in the kitchens. They are dressed in green and mainly clean up the house, cook dinner, run errands, and care for the children, if there are any. They'd usually come from backgrounds in young childcare and cooking, though in practice, any sinful woman who is good with her hands can become one. They are pretty mistreated and forgotten a lot of the time. After a year or two of Gilead's existence, their invisibility allows them to form a network amongst themselves that's connected to the Mayday resistance. Their lives are also far better than the next group I'm about to describe. And when Rachel saw that she bore Jacob no children, Rachel envied her sister and said unto Jacob, Give me children, or else I shall die. And Jacob's anger was kindled against Rachel as he said, Am I in the place of God who hath withheld thee from the fruit of the womb? And Rachel said, Behold my maid Bilhah, go in unto her, that she may bear upon my knees, and that I may have children by her. The handmaids are, as you can probably guess, the center of the story. When the fertile women were taken to the Red Centers, they were indoctrinated and trained to become special maids who were posted to the homes of the commanders. They are then impregnated on the hands of the infertile wives during monthly sessions known as the ceremonies. Once the babies are born and weaned, they are taken away, and the handmaid is sent to a different household. Handmaids are dressed in red robes. Red is the color of fertility. It also makes it easier to catch handmaids who escape. Handmaids are typically those who have sinned and worked sinful jobs in the past. Any woman in Gilead who sins can also become a handmaid if caught. Being fertile, handmaids are considered a national resource and necessary for humanity's survival. Most importantly, handmaids have their original names taken from them and replaced with the name to show who their commander is. The main character is called Offred, short for of Fred, as in property of Fred. This continues on. Of Kyle, of Warren, of Jonathan, etc. Needless to say, their existence is miserable. They're also managed heavily by the aunts. The Jezebels are women who have sinned by Gilead's definition, but are also young and attractive enough to work in secret brothels that some commanders visit. They are dressed in pink and beige dresses, and when they get too old or unruly, they are sent to the colonies. This brings us to unwomen and men are basically people who have sinned beyond redemption and so are sent to the penal colonies in Missouri, Arizona, Utah, or SoCal, where they shovel up radioactive waste until they inevitably die. The end. When Gilead rose to power, large amounts of young children or teens whose parents were declared unfit were forcibly taken from their families and adopted by commanders and wives. Many older children who were taken were more resistant and ran away, while younger children were indoctrinated to accept their new reality. Boys and girls are heavily segregated up until marriage. Daughters are dressed in baby pink, and sons in baby blue. Males are taught to read, while girls aren't. Once puberty hits, girls become plums waiting to be eligible to be married off. Boys, on the other hand, are dressed in navy blue and continue with school or do military service, where they are groomed to become the next generation of commanders, guardians, and abusers. Moving into 2016, Gilead consolidates their power, carrying out a second internal purge of more moderate elements of the government. Both the Washington and Bunker monuments are turned into crosses. While Gilead successfully manages to crush many rebel American pockets, including the Californians, a now independent Republic of Texas manages to push Gilead out of the state completely, even gaining land in Oklahoma and Arizona. By 2018, they also managed to invade Louisiana and take New Orleans before reaching a stalemate. Gilead also reaches a stalemate with the rebels in Florida. The city of Chicago becomes the last major stronghold for May Day in the US, making it a target for a relentless bombing campaign by Gilead. The Underground Railroad is brought back, this time to aid the escape of women and homelanders, mainly through Maine and North Dakota. Outside of Gilead, the exiled U.S. government in Anchorage reinstates the Constitution, making the former Vice President Joe Biden the president in exile. The refugee crisis only gets worse, and Mexico soon begins constructing a wall on its northern border to keep refugees out. American refugees in Canada are welcomed with mostly open arms at first and housed in neighborhoods known as Little Americas. In the UK, refugees are also reluctantly welcomed despite rising unemployment issues. A rise in populism means that the other EU countries close themselves off. Civil wars in Central America in the midst of the collapse allow most Central American states to unify under the Sandinistas with full Russian and Chinese backing. Other parts of the world are also thrown into turmoil due to the sudden withdrawal of the US. Border troubles at the DMZ increase, with North Korea even more emboldened to threaten its southern neighbor. ISIS activity in the MENA region skyrockets, leading to most West African states declaring total war against the group in 2019. In 2016, ISIS also takes Damascus and Baghdad, creating a formalized Gilead-style Islamic state in the Fertile Crescent and sending other Arab states into panic. Fighting still continues though, mainly in Kurdistan. While most countries in the world have sanctions on Gilead and refuse to engage diplomatically with it in any way, some, particularly in South America and Africa, begin to normalize relations out of economic necessity. By 2019, the euro takes the spot as the world's #1 currency over the defunct dollar. Gilead does have a currency and passports for that matter, but it's very limited and only accessible to men. Women, on the other hand, have to rely on ration tokens, and their travel is very limited. Because most of them aren't allowed to read, they also rely on pictograms to find their way around. Internet access is restricted to high-level commanders only. In the rest of the world, most of the internet and social media as we know it still functions normally, though with a massive drop in American presence and lots of disturbing coverage over the ongoing situation. The series officially starts around early 2017. By that point, the birth rate in Gilead starts to go back up, albeit by horrifying means. This is roughly the map of Gilead circa January of 2017. Although it's only been 2 years, for people inside of Gilead, it feels like it's been decades. By this time, the country has manually reverted itself to a cultural state similar to the 19th century. Public executions and public displays of brutality are very common. The theocratic legal system makes it normal for crude punishments to take place in accordance with Old Testament law. The few people who've managed to successfully escape tell of horrifying stories, while letters come out every day containing horrible details. There is barely any tourism, and just like North Korea, Gilead is a hermit state, where few can enter or leave, and very little is known about its inner workings. The UN and ICC places arrest warrants on all the named leaders of Gilead. Despite this, many countries start to unfortunately take interest in the fact that Gilead is beginning to make more children. Countries like Mexico, Argentina, China, and Brazil start to secretly re-establish diplomacy in an attempt to trade resources for handmaids. On the bright side, carbon emissions in Gilead have gone down by nearly 80%. Canada and the European Union continue to fund rebel groups. The Vermont Republic gets Canadian backing in its independence and becomes an important part of the Underground Railroad. Resistance radios broadcast news and outside music into Gilead, hoping to incite rebellion. Loudspeakers are also set up along Canada's southern border to blast pre-Gilead music into the country and serve as a guide for Underground Railroad travelers at night. In October of 2019, rebel handmaids smuggle 86 stolen commanders' children along with Martha's to Canada via cargo plane in an event known as Angel's Flight. To Gilead, this is known as the Night of Tears and becomes a massive point of political tension. In Chicago, 4 years of open rebel fighting comes to an end when Gilead basically levels the entire city, allowing them to completely retake it. The humanitarian crisis this creates is unprecedented, and it is at this point that Canada starts to grow weary of American refugees. Entering the 2020s, anti-American immigrant sentiment grows in Canada and the UK. With housing prices going up, protests become more common. In 2021, the conservative Canadian government under Poilievre begins to deport some American communities to Alaska and Hawaii, and even starts to consider recognizing Gilead as a country. This comes as Gilead launches a propaganda campaign into Canada. They also begin sending missionaries, known as Pearl Girls, into Canada and Latin America to bring women into Gilead and join its godly struggle. Reformist factions in the Gileadian government, mainly led by Commander Joseph Lawrence, also push to make it easier for American refugees to return back to their homelands. In Massachusetts, the city of New Bethlehem is founded as a special semi-autonomous pocket within Gilead, where strict religious laws are relaxed and public executions are outlawed. Gilead also begins creating Magdalene colonies out west, where unruly handmaids are sent to work in farms, while commanders visit to perform ceremonies before leaving and collecting the babies once they are born. I am so sorry, this is messed up on so many levels. Conservative factions are no doubt resistant to this change, and begin planning another purge. While Gilead is distracted with reformist division, the US government in exile begins taking matters into their own hands. In December of 2021, after the wedding of a high-ranking commander in Boston, the handmaids in the city rise up, killing their captors in their sleep. The sudden loss of so many commanders debilitates Gilead forces, allowing the US Air Force to launch a surprise invasion on the city of Boston. The fighting only lasts 19 days before all of Boston and the surrounding areas are liberated. Too confused and disorganized, the Gilead army is forced to retreat. The last of the Boston commanders are shot down from a plane bound for Washington, D.C. By the spring of 2022, Boston becomes a free state under US control. Throughout the mid-2020s, Gilead makes repeated attempts to retake Boston, with no success. The Boston invasion is the point where the Handmaid's Tale series officially ends. The sequel series, The Testaments, starts 4 years later in the spring of 2026. By that point, several purges have already taken place since the war in Massachusetts. Many of the national homelanders were also sent on forced marches to prevent their rebellion in the event of an American invasion. New Bethlehem was also shut down and reabsorbed for security reasons. The focus of the Testaments shifts from the handmaids to the younger plum girls and commanders' daughters. Over a decade of Gilead's existence means an entire generation of children now either barely remember or don't remember at all what the US was like. To them, Gilead is their status quo. From their point of view, Gilead is heaven on earth, God's kingdom recreated by man. They needn't worry about the rest of the world because Gilead is the world. Everyone and everything outside of Gilead has been corrupted by Satan. Canada is a scary place of godless heathens. From here, mapping the timeline becomes harder because the Testament series is still ongoing and we've only had one season, so I'll continue based on what's mostly implied in the book. Bear in mind, though, that as the Testament series continues, with more seasons to come in the future, some events I've created here will probably be altered. By the late 2020s, Gilead's war is at a near standstill. Although most rebel pockets in the plains are now gone, the Texas and New England fronts are at a stalemate, while the Baptist Florida rebels are on the run. Internationally, though still being pretty isolated, Gilead's main allies are Iran, Russia, Afghanistan, North Korea, and ISIS. The EU stands in a political Cold War with Gilead and an economic Cold War with China as it slowly takes over as the world's #1 superpower. By this time, Gilead's government has a massive corruption problem. Frequent purges have also weakened their authority, allowing the resistance to get away with more attacks. Many high-ranking aunts and wives have also been secretly working to dismantle the regime from within by providing intelligence and leaking incriminating documents abroad. Meanwhile, after over a decade of research, the universities of Toronto and Hawaii come out with a joint paper naming the clear causes of infertility. In it is discovered that part of the problem was also male infertility, with silent chlamydia and gonorrhea epidemics reducing sperm counts across wide chunks of the male population. Pollution is also cited. With this research, global scientists set out to work on a cure for infertility. Gilead naturally denounces this research, mainly because one of its indirect aims is to make the handmaid system look completely pointless and backwards. In 2029, access to medical treatments for infertility, as well as artificial insemination and IVF, is massively expanded in many countries across the world. With global pollution levels also dropping after a decade-long series of drastic reforms, falling birth rates in Canada and the EU, among other states, start to rebound. Yet the handmaid system is still not abolished in Gilead. With this, in 2030, the UN permanently bars Gilead from entry as a member state. Increased isolation means that Gilead's economy nearly collapses again the following year. Another purge takes place. Liberal commanders are strung up for heresy, wives and aunts mysteriously vanish, more unpeople and homelanders are sent on forced marches to nowhere in particular, and a new crop of radical and even more inexperienced younger commanders enter the government. This chaos allows the US military to finally expand outwards out of the Boston area and link up with the Vermont Republic. The Maine campaign is then launched, where the states of New Hampshire and Maine are slowly liberated by 2033, creating a massive front line in New England. Gilead declares a heavenly crusade of the righteous against godless scum in response to this. As more resources are diverted, US-affiliated forces on the West Coast start to link up as well. Texas also makes advances. Fearing defections, the Gileadian military leaders start to take matters into their own hands. In July of 2033, a military coup takes place. We get the drill. New Angel-affiliated commanders take over, many old ones are shot, more wives vanish, aunts suddenly become unwomen, and stricter curfews are placed on Econo people. All the while, Gilead grows even more rogue. In October, they blame the rebel victories on Canadian and EU support. To combat this, Gilead begins assassinating key Canadian and American refugee activists abroad. They also frantically target American military positions in Canada and Alaska with missiles, which is stupid. Most missiles are shot down, and Canada, along with the rest of NATO, is given an official justification to take part in the war against Gilead as a coalition. Gileadian state propaganda frames this as foreign powers being intent to destroy not only the country of Gilead, but the Christian religion itself. As they get desperate, the government starts to break down due to infighting. Incriminating books and documents are burnt. Not wanting their crimes to be found, many cities begin to deport their handmaids and Jezebels to places where they'd eventually meet their demise. Mass graves grow even more crowded. Children are evacuated to the countryside. Foreign tanks roll down interstates lined with nameless bodies hanging from streetlights. NATO special operations target many nuclear bases and missile silos in the Midwest. The winter brings famine to many parts of central Gilead, which only prompts more guardians and angels to defect. Econo people in Cleveland, Gary, Lexington, and Atlanta also rebel due to food shortages. News is cut off in many places. On March 25, 2034, coalition forces make landings on Charleston and Virginia Beach. American paratrooper landings also take place in other key American cities. Most commanders would understand that the end is near. Many of them either end their lives on their own terms or make deals with friendly groups abroad to be safely transported out of Gilead, mainly to Latin America or certain African countries. In July, Washington, D.C. is finally besieged by coalition forces and the remnants of the weakened Gileadian government officially surrenders. On July 9th, the Divine Republic of Gilead ceases to exist, bringing an end to nearly 2 decades of violence and repression. All remaining commanders and military leaders, along with most aunts, wives, guardians, and eyes, are captured, and the continental US is placed under joint coalition occupation. While the rest of the world celebrates, the tone is much more mixed in America. Many parts of the country are left war-torn and extremely traumatized. The ensuing mental health crisis is on a scale never before seen in human history. It's something that takes decades to solve. The country is also severely depopulated. New York City is extremely quiet. What few national homelands and colonies are left are freed, only to discover the remnants of unspeakable atrocities and severe malnourishment. Captured Gileadian officials and collaborators are taken to New York to be tried for crimes against humanity and war crimes. Some high-profile commanders are taken to The Hague. Many are given life sentences, while most high-ranking commanders are executed. On the other hand, many former wives, aunts, and guardians are reintegrated into society, only for them to be socially ostracized and shunned for the rest of their lives. By 2034, everyone under the age of around 25 would not properly remember a time before Gilead. To them, Gilead was a country they called home, a home which suddenly collapsed at the hands of people they were told were sinful monsters. Many of them would be severely brainwashed. Most girls would also be completely illiterate. While many would slowly come to terms with the reality and adapt over the years, many also do not. For a decade or two after Gilead's collapse, minor neo-Gilead insurgencies would pop up, particularly in the Appalachians, and would need to be put back down. Throughout 2035 to 37, more and more states would be reintegrated back into the United States, and more toxic wastes in the former colonies would be cleared out amidst reconstruction efforts. In this new US, all former Gilead affiliates would be banned from public office, though this wouldn't stop the emergence of Gilead-esque politicians from appearing. Special ministries and constitutional amendments are also added to prevent something like Gilead from ever appearing again. Vermont rejoins the US in 2037, and Florida does the same in 2038. By the end of the 2030s, pretty much all of the continental US apart from Texas is brought back together. Texas eventually rejoins in 2045, around the time when many American refugees start to return in droves. Post-Gilead America in the 2040s would be slightly weakened and very risk-averse. With national trauma still strong, society is much quieter and culturally simplistic and innocent. Religious adherence also sees a decline. However, by 2059, the 25-year anniversary of VG Day, a new generation of post-Gilead freedom babies start to enter adulthood. Children born and raised during the Gilead era are now mostly in their 30s and 40s, and have become a very silent and underrepresented group. Over time, the people after Gilead start to re-diversify the culture, while the people who remember Gilead only grow older, to the point where their input to society becomes irrelevant. As time goes on, Gilead is increasingly relegated to the history books. Rather disturbingly, the Handmaid's Tale book ends with an epilogue set in the year 2195, well over a century since Gilead's collapse. By that point, the United States is broken up once again, this time into smaller, freer nations, some of which are run by Native Americans. A Canadian history professor is carrying out a lecture in Gileadian history. In it, he downplays many parts of Gilead's crimes, even going so far as to sympathize with some of their aims. This implies that long after Gilead is gone, people have naturally forgotten what it was like or how severe their crimes were, thereby being destined to repeat the same mistakes over and over again. Now that the timeline is over, I would end the video here, but I feel like I need to add some commentary. When reading or watching The Handmaid's Tale, it's very easy to be horrified by some of the crimes committed and then be thankful that it's all just fiction. Except you'd be very wrong. When writing the book, Margaret Atwood made it a rule that not one crime, atrocity, misfortune, or mere feature that is included should be something that hasn't happened or isn't happening right now. This rule was then carried forward into the TV show. This means that everything you see has happened to real people in real life multiple times in the past, the present, and almost certainly in the future. Gilead is real, both physically and metaphorically, and there are many examples of when we've seen it before. One of Atwood's direct social inspirations was 17th century Puritan New England, when the New World colonies were governed under very strict Protestant ideals. The Salem witch trials in 1692 was a demonstration of how religious and moral panic can breed fear and paranoia. Hangings became a frequent occurrence, and women were disproportionately targeted. Neighbors snitched on neighbors, and court trials were very rushed. The ideals by which New Englanders lived by were very similar to those back in England around the same period. Cromwell's Commonwealth has quite a few parallels to Gilead too. After a period of civil war between the royalists and the parliamentarians, the English monarchy was overthrown and Charles I was executed. In his place, Oliver Cromwell established a Commonwealth Republic in Britain and hoped to move England in the direction of godliness and purity. From 1649 to 1660, England was ruled under a staunchly Protestant system. Theatre-going, gambling, and Christmas, among other festivals, were banned for being sinful and ungodly. The new model army was set up partly to enforce these ideals, all while terrible atrocities were committed in military campaigns against the Irish Catholics. In the early 1700s, the transatlantic slave trade was greatly expanded, becoming the largest system of human trafficking in history. Slaves were taken from Africa to the American colonies, where they'd become commodities to be bought and sold. American slaves were dehumanized, most had their names changed against their will, and were forcibly converted to Christianity. Many black families were irreversibly separated too. Cruel punishments were also used daily, and none were taught how to read. Many black female housemaids were also personally exploited by their masters. There are many examples at all levels of American society where white slave owners engaged in affairs with their black slaves. If a slave was impregnated, it was also not uncommon for her to be sold shortly after birth, while the fate of the mixed-race child lay in the hands of the white family. Slavery proved to be a very controversial topic in the mid-19th century, a time when industrialization made it more obsolete. It took a full-on civil war with a group of rebel Confederate states to finally do away with the institution. And yet, even after Reconstruction, black Americans had to endure nearly a century of Jim Crow and limited civil rights. Many whites, even today, still make attempts to justify the existence of the Confederate States, a country which was founded with the primary goal of preserving human slavery. The 19th and early 20th centuries were also a terrible time for Native Americans. Besides being consistently displaced in genocides and expulsions, many Native American children in the US and Canada were taken away from their communities and placed into Catholic boarding schools in the middle of nowhere. There, their names, identities, and traditions were erased in an attempt to civilize them. These children usually never saw their families again and regularly faced abuse and humiliation. Many examples of Gilead in real life are much closer to the present. In 1965, Romanian President Nicolae Ceausescu banned abortion and contraception in an effort to increase the population and raise the birth rate. Women were pressured to reproduce, and those that were pregnant were usually highly monitored. Gynecological exams became mandatory, and any children that were abandoned or unwanted were placed in state-sponsored orphanages where they were treated poorly. In 1976, a military coup overthrew the government of Argentina, establishing a brutal dictatorship under Jorge Fidela and beginning a 7-year period known as the Dirty War. During this period, oppositional groups that the government deemed a threat were targeted in a statewide purge. It was claimed that this was an effort to combat terrorism. Many people were randomly abducted in the streets by security forces and never seen again. Children of families deemed opposed to the state were often kidnapped and placed in more fit households, usually run by military or government-affiliated people. Dissident pregnant women were imprisoned and monitored in facilities. Once their babies were born, they'd be taken away while the mothers were executed. Today, many surviving parents, now in elderhood, are still looking for their stolen children. Though not technically theocratic, North Korea is also a perfect example of a highly isolated society where people are oppressed and have no access to the outside world. Disobedience, or lack of devotion to the supreme leader, can get you killed. Stadium executions are not unknown. North Korean society remains very behind in terms of culture and technology too. Meanwhile, their southern neighbor is one of the most advanced and culturally thriving countries in the world. Every year, they accept North Korean defectors and refugees, many of whom are very traumatized and barely made it out alive. However, South Korea, along with Japan and China, are going through their own issues, particularly with infertility, and only time will tell where that goes. Iran was another society that Atwood took direct inspiration from. Although it was ruled by an authoritarian government put in place by the CIA, Iran in the 1960s and 70s was considered one of the most liberal, secular, and culturally diverse places in the region. This all changed with the Iranian Revolution, when the Shah's government was overthrown in favor of a theocratic Islamic republic under Ayatollah Khomeini. Women seemingly lost their rights overnight. Modesty laws were introduced, which made it mandatory for women to wear hijab as per Islamic law. Protests occurred, but to no avail. Many women were even glad to take part in the enforcement of these new laws. This system and culture is still mostly in place in Iran to this day. Now, it's very hard for most to imagine an Iran that looks like this instead of this. Saudi Arabia also felt similar conservative reprisals as well. Starting in the late 1970s, when the Grand Mosque in Mecca was temporarily occupied by Islamic militants, the Saudi government started aligning itself more with Wahhabist Islamic principles to increase its legitimacy. Women were banned from driving, and dress codes were very strict. Most women were slowly pushed out of public roles as well. The religious police were expanded, and gender segregation was enforced. Only recently, the Saudi government has started to make reforms that allow women to drive and dress and travel freely, though many of the old policies are still in place. Syria and Iraq are also no stranger to religious extremism. In the mid-2010s, under the rule of ISIS, a harsh interpretation of Islamic Sharia law was enforced. Millions of people were banned from listening to music, dressing freely, smoking, or mingling with the other gender. Missing prayers put you under suspicion from the religious police. Brutal public executions and capital punishments were utilized. In 2015, when news of ISIS soldiers throwing gay men off buildings reached the internet, many commenters outside the region simply made jokes or voiced support. In Afghanistan, when Taliban militants took over in 2021, the country reverted to a state it was in before 2001, where women had virtually no rights and girls struggled to access education. At the time of the takeover, viral videos were released of people panicking at airports in Kabul and female workers being ushered out of banks. Nazi Germany probably serves as the best real-life example of Gilead as a blueprint. Although the economy and political situation was fluctuating at the time, German society in the 1920s was also one of the most progressive and forward-thinking in the world. Then the Great Depression hit, plunging the country into an economic crisis that devastated millions and sent unemployment through the roof. Many felt their government had failed them and began calling for stability over all else. This was when the Nazi Party made its final rise to power. For a party that was only around 14 years old at the time, the Nazis seized control very quickly. Many disenfranchised workers, particularly young men, joined the party in the early 1930s and became part of the Brown Shirts. Many survivors also described how the party made them feel like superheroes destined to save Germany from its peril. Upon being elected to office, Hitler used the burning of the Reichstag to justify the Enabling Act, through which he secured absolute control. Political opponents were sent to prison camps, while undesirables quickly lost their rights. Liberalism was curbed, and Jews became the subhuman enemies of the state. German women were told to procreate and make as many children as possible. These children were raised to fall in line with the state and became the indoctrinated Hitler Youth. Entering World War II, many minorities in Germany were deported or sent to ghettos. All of this culminated in the infamous Final Solution. When the regime collapsed, and many of its officials and collaborators were put on trial in Nuremberg, some tried to justify their actions as necessary and righteous. Many former soldiers who engaged in atrocities claimed that they were only following orders. There are so many other examples I could talk about. For Handmaids, among the main inspirations were the Hitler Maidens in Germany and the comfort women in Japanese-occupied territories during World War II. For the colonies, there are many examples, including the Australian penal colonies under the British Empire, the North Korean prison camps, the Nazi concentration camps during World War II, and the Soviet work camps and gulags in Siberia. For child marriages, we don't need to go far. Though there have been some recent reforms, many South Asian communities still normalize child brides and coercive forced marriages. The US government in exile in Alaska and Hawaii equates to the Republic of China in exile in Taiwan, while New Bethlehem is loosely based on Hong Kong. As for other examples of ethno-religious atrocities, expulsions, and division, there are way too many, a lot of which are going on right now as you watch this video. This all means that, with Gilead, we essentially get a dystopia that is an amalgamation of all these horrors. A totalitarian, theocratic, patriarchal, military dictatorship. The Handmaid's Tale is by no means a critique of religion itself. In fact, the whole point is that Gilead has exploited Christianity for its own personal gain, often resorting to serious cherry-picking to justify their existence. In order to justify the handmaid system, they use the beginning of the Rachel and Bilhah story in the book of Genesis. In it, one of Jacob's wives, Rachel, is unable to bear children, and in her despair offers her handmaid Bilhah to be impregnated on her behalf. If you continue to read from that point though, you'd go on to discover that Rachel eventually does have children on her own, making the whole ordeal pointless. Gilead is also a real place in modern-day Jordan, and is mentioned quite a bit in the early Old Testament. In the Bible, the balm of Gilead is supposed to be a resin, associated with healing and restoration, which ironically contrasts the suffering and pain in the modern American Gilead. Besides the influence of misogyny, The Handmaid's Tale also serves to expose humanity's worst potential, how humans have been able to do terrible things to one another. Things of this nature can happen anywhere, and have happened everywhere. The phrase, "it can't happen here," is a very dangerous idea to spread, because there is no such thing as a country that is immune to authoritarianism. It is hard to gain rights, and once you have them, they are very easy to lose. In every country, there are people who would much rather prefer a Gilead-like system to be put in place. These people roam amongst us, every single day. The sons of Jacob were not a group of mysterious evil boogeymen or rogue officials called to oppress America. As stated, most members came from various different backgrounds. Some were politicians, some were soldiers, some were teachers, others were lawyers, judges, janitors, doctors, pastors, economists, the unemployed, all of whom came together to eventually end up at the top of the hierarchy, all wearing the same black and white suits and becoming oppressive monsters. Before he was a dictator, Hitler was a failing artist on the streets of Vienna. Himmler was a chicken farmer. Nikolai Ceausescu was a shoemaker. Stalin was a Georgian peasant. Mao was also a peasant. Mussolini was a schoolteacher, and Saddam Hussein was a poor farm boy. It can happen anywhere, and many would argue that it is happening right now.